first panel after lunch. Sorry, Zach and Ryan, I have to break you guys up. We are going to start. And Ryan is on the panel, so it's quite necessary that he's in the game with us here. So welcome back, everybody. We are going to continue with the conversation. And again, highlighting the fact that we sat in a roundtable sort of function. In fact, Ryan on the next panels was with us at that event. I'll ask all three of my panelists to come up right now. And where did Henry go? He was just sitting there talking to Hans. Okay. I will stall slightly until Henry comes up. But we were talking in Chicago about the very things we started the day with in terms of how we bring both the up and down capital stack, the layer cake, and the thematic spectrum of the types of investment areas. And so this panel, we're going to be focusing on that up and down layer cake. Of course, we can't get the entire set of layers on stage, but we've got good representation for some of the layers that we're trying to embed here. One of the conversations that I had at lunch coming right out of this morning was, for those that are not in the blue stack right now, there's a question. Henry, come on up on stage. We're not waiting for you. I'm just killing time. And as you can see, this is meant to be pretty informal and for us to really have a conversation like we had this morning and kind of get into brass tacks. So one of the conversations I had at lunch with someone that was here who has not been doing this work, and a gentleman that I just spoke with who I was introduced to last night, is if we haven't been in that space, what's the best way to enter that space? Meaning, is it on the stack and fitting in? Henry has an interesting story about how he's doing what he's doing right now. Or is it on the thematic side? Is it something they pick and then they come into the work because of whatever that thematic is, sector or industry, right? So for this panel, we will try to stick to the conversation on the capital stack. It's difficult to not veer into one theme or another because of specialization. So let me introduce the panel very quickly, and I'll just go down the panel this way. So Kelsey Zile is the CEO of Invest, and one of the reasons that I was interested in having Kelsey with us is that a set of funders that she's working with and gathering together, some of it into the ocean, and what that looks like is one perspective that in order to get groups of people gathered together, how do we do this, right? So Invest, if you don't know it, Kelsey will explain what they're doing, but that angle for us is really important because we're trying to find more and more champions. To Kelsey's right is Ryan Bellissimo. He is with Progression, and he'll tell you all about that because that is a very interesting way of bringing people together around very fun things in some cases that allow different parties to work together. He also represents a family office who will not be named. So it has a perspective from that viewpoint as well. And again, we can't have everybody up on stage, but you can see that what we're trying to do is assemble as many of the sort of Blue Avengers as possible. And Henry, we had a conversation about his background out of the ocean and now into the ocean with SG2. SG2 doing a portion of its funding in the ocean space and later stage. So you heard this morning a lot of conversation about startups and innovation and sort of national policies from NOAA's standpoint. And again, I asked the question about what's that middle ground and in this capital stack, and for people who are not in the room, how do we get them all starting to work together? So welcome to all of you, and thanks very much for taking the time. As we said this morning, if you're in this room, then you're already halfway to the point of really caring about what it is that we're speaking about. So the first question I have for all of you that then helps you start to explain your organization and its role is, how do we more holistically do this? And I keep doing the sort of vertical here. How do we keep how do we start doing more of bringing that together? We each have had different conversations. As I said, Ryan was there last fall when we were in Chicago, and there's a few things he said then that I hope he'll reiterate here about who's in the room and who's not in the room and how we get them. So how do we start to do this work more holistically from your viewpoints? And that allows you to explain a little bit about what you do. So we'll start with you, Kelsey.
Yeah, so on the invest side, our specific focus is on the venture lens. So we help connect mostly sub $500 million funds and make their life easier. And one of those focus areas has been oceans. So we have 90 funds in our membership community. And a big goal of our ocean sector group and our ocean work is that we can actually increase that number of those that have oceans in their thesis. So we bring together existing ocean experts and then also open up those sector groups to our other members to help learn, de-risk, understand where there's actual venture scale investment opportunities. And that's something that I want us all to double click on. We heard it earlier. But again, just to clarify, so we work with funds that are doing at least $1 million in climate a year and at least 3 investments in climate. That's very broad, but the idea and where this came about is that it's a challenging space. There's a lot of knowledge share. There's also a lot of heavy lifting, like, do I go to EarthX? How do I find LPs? How do I understand if this startup is more fit for grant funding versus venture funding? And so we bring them together. It's a membership community, and then we try to build out these spaces, both from like a in-person connection and data sharing standpoint, but also from like a platform. How do you get your recent report in front of all of the other ocean investors? So before I hand it off, I'll just say we started with a little bit of funding to build out our ocean sector group 3 years ago and increased from 4 funds that were investing in oceans as a core part of their thesis to 29 now. And another part of what we're doing is trying to expand that geographically. So I'm in Austin, Texas right now. I'm here. Oceans isn't always top of mind, but they're it covers the whole planet. And then making sure that we also have footing in London. Australia is another area we've been expanding in. So it's kind of high level what we're focused on. So over to you, Ryan.
Awesome. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks, everyone. At Progression, what we do, the high-level thesis is we're trying to use the culture of outdoor sports to depolarize what has become a very politically charged term in climate. And I think under this administration, we've seen it's almost culturally taboo to even associate yourself with climate these days or sustainability. And I don't think we're going to solve the capital stack coordination if we don't leverage culture to bring more people into the capital stack, into investing into these verticals. But one, to create a more neutral room where we can talk about things not from a policy lens, but from an innovation lens. So through Progression, we partner with organizations like World Surf League. I know some of you guys were at our Huntington Beach event at the Lexus US Open of Surfing. We just hosted our last event 3 weeks ago with the US ski and snowboard team. If anyone watched the Winter Olympics, we had a bunch of Olympic athletes out there. They hosted us at their Olympic training facility. And we focused all on clean energy and climate resilience. And we had, we bring together through the Progression ecosystem, not just venture stage investors, but we have later stage investors, we have infrastructure partners, we have industry leaders and operators that can create synergies for the companies. Because it takes to take a company through the valley of death in the capital stack. It's not just about capital. We need policy to work along with it. We need industry partners. We need corporate venture and more patient capital stakeholders, right? And corporates coming in to help these hardware companies that don't exit on a software timeline. Most companies right now are looking for venture capital funding because they watch Shark Tank and they want to raise equity-based financing. But the reality is, especially in ocean tech, where, let's be real, the problems we're solving in ocean tech right now are not software problems. They are hardware problems. It is a real-world physical issue of destroying our oceans that we're dealing with right now. So it's going to take capital-intensive, real-world solutions to solve it. And I think we really need to start bringing the conversation around how we coordinate these different capital stack stakeholders into the same conversation, because we a lot of times they're not even in the same room. So we're not going to be able to create systems of passing off a venture scale investment to infrastructure if we're not aligned or even in the same rooms and having the same conversations. So that's what Progression's all about, and I can chat more about it with everyone. Our next event, Oceans 2026, will be in Western Australia, December 9th Yeah, buy your tickets now to Australia. But it will be December 9th through 12th with Bill Tye's group, if you guys know Acti Global. And we're going to be bringing together World Surf League, World Sailing, PADI for the divers, and Kiteboarding Australia. So whatever your poison is, we'll have an opportunity to participate in those activities with professional athletes, and then hear some really amazing ocean tech companies present in Australia. So I will pass it off to you, Henry.
Thank you, Ryan. Great to be here. Thanks for having SUG. So I represent SUG, and we started around 10 years ago as a venture capital firm, and specifically as the direct investment arm of Lucas Walton's family office. And Lucas, coming from the Walmart background, naturally, he's very into the sustainability, the supply chain, the food and agriculture. So we started off as a food and agriculture fund. And as we progressed, we thought about how do we cover the entire ecosystem beyond food and agriculture, and that's where oceans and energy come in. So we have been operating as a VC firm for the last 10 years, and we recently experienced a transition as we're seeing a lot of these, early stage companies shifting towards later stage. So they're needing, the Series B, Series C capital funding. This, it's not there some of the times. So we made the transition into a growth equity firm, and now, we're really focusing on supporting whether that's the previous portfolio company or companies that already passed that, proving your business concept, proving your business model. You have some traction now. You're just needing the capital to scale. You're at that pivotal point. That's where SUG comes in. And, how we think about it is more like, we are supporting the growth stage of these companies, but who do we pass these companies on to at the next phase, right? So as we think about who do we want to bring into the capital stack is usually, whoever's after us or whoever's coming in with us. And, sometimes it's only us as SUG that supporting the oceans companies at the growth stage. But now we're seeing more general investors tap into the space whenever the company is more like, their business model may be a software company, right? But they have the ocean theme, and that's where SUG look into them, but also the general SaaS or software investors, they will tap into the space, not because they are looking to oceans investment, but because they're looking into that business model, right? And I think that's, I think that's a great opportunity for SUG, everyone else, even the companies, right? Everyone to kind of how do we communicate that, and how do we, tap into the general investor space, maybe from a different angle, maybe not so much oceans, but from the business model, from what they're doing, from their traction, so and the growth story. So that's kind of how we think about as a firm, who do we bring on to the capital stack.
So just to stick with that a little bit, you and I were talking, and you had not worked in the ocean space, right? And you had worked at very late stage. From a personal standpoint, as you talk to people in the audience and people that are here and trying to look into the ocean, and this is kind of a question for all of you, but really I'll in some ways put Henry on the spot, because you made that jump. You're asking others to make the jump with you. Other than that very, very clear economic return, how are you personally, and also those that you start to talk to, how have you made that jump? How do you help us make that jump to the blue side? Because it's very underfunded compared to lots of other spaces in the climate.
Yeah, I think it's definitely part of the story that we have to tell. Because when I think about some of the stories they're telling, or some of the solutions they're coming up, is more so on the public good value side, right? So when they think about it, it's more like, how do we save the oceans? How do we save environment, right? And they might mix up the value they provide at first, right? It's probably a combination of public good value and private cash flow value. They're starting off, right? They're thinking, hey, we're protecting the planet, but we are also making some money on the side, or it's half and half, right? And that ambiguity, I think, is hard for investors, and it's hard for an exit. It's hard for I think the general capital stack to keep on progressing it and moving it forward to the next stage. And I think that the sequential, like that sequence is very important, right? You have the initial grant or like very early stage investor to support the company, and then you just keep passing it on. But now, even I think as Suji, right, as we're just making the transition, is that boundary is kind of blurry sometimes. And even we're growth equity investor now, we're still maybe tapping to the late venture stage, and that is just because it's so early. That is because they're limited investors. But as we're thinking about how do we bring more people in, how do we make this process more mature, is you sticking to the stage that you're good at and best fit for you, right? And I think that's kind of like that. Hopefully that answered the question. But.
Yeah, no. And I mean, I think for both of you, like, so what's that version, your version of that same kind of story?
Yeah, I'll add to that, because I've worked with you guys quite a bit, and I think one of the things that you do that is clever and we should see more of across all of the verticals, but Oceans in particular, is you guys work with CVCs, but you sometimes are co-investing alongside corporations because they need it for their supply chain. And so I think actually putting $1 to the value of a fishery supply. More things that I'd like to see too is hearing a voice from other corporations, like in the tourism space or anywhere that the cost of biodiversity loss or really high intensity weather events is going to be felt. And that is one of the things that I think in the next 5 years we can actually get some serious corporate money coming out of, rather than being reliant on this government funding. So that's where I'd love to have more conversations about that and hear more from corporations of like, what's an actual supply chain risk? Like, obviously we want beautiful oceans, but how do we actually find that durable money coming from these corporate contracts? And on my end, how do we then kind of relay that all the way down the chain so that these earlier stage investors are hearing from Amerisk or like the Zemba Maritime Buyers Alliance, like this solution doesn't exist today, and that's where early venture dollars should be going. So that's kind of that arc that I want to see a lot more of, while we're still working to put a price tag on nature and oceans in particular.
Yeah, we'll come back to that in a little bit, because this conversation that I just had before we started really is planted a seed. But you were going to say something too, Ryan.
No, I was going to say from my perspective, I think, and people have heard this in the room, there hasn't been a unicorn exit in Oceans that's going to naturally attract the market and capital as it's done in other areas of clean or deep in climate tech. And we've seen Nest, for instance, with at-home tech that's not Elon related, or SpaceX, or of course Tesla, and some of these bigger exits that have given investors confidence that there's alpha to be made in a venture scale return. With that said, I think a lot of the funds now, I mean, what that points to is we need maybe the fund model doesn't work for ocean tech, and maybe we've created silos of excellence because we have these billionaires spinning up funds around oceans and tackling oceans problems where it's almost like a spray and pray approach, right? We're giving a little bit of money to a lot of different problems and companies. If we really want to tackle direct air capture on ships or just electrifying transportation in the oceans, we should have an entire fund dedicated or entire institutions dedicated to just tackling and creating one successful unicorn within oceans. And that's how we can successfully get more institutional investors to want to go into the ocean space. I think we are taking almost a slot machine approach, where we're setting up funds to invest into disparate IP holders, and we've created a very fragmented ecosystem where now everyone's competing for cautious venture capital funding when it's not going to come, it's not going to be there. A lot of these companies are too risky at this point for infrastructure and debt. So perhaps we need to consolidate. Perhaps we need to consolidate efforts to one problem within oceans and get to a winner there in order to then successfully bring more capital into the space. A little bit of a contrarian view, but yeah.
No. And it's interesting, too, because this relates back to the availability or not of public funding and financing for various levels. And I think one of the questions that, we have to continue to tackle until such time as there is more private in some form, whatever that form may be, how do we, all of us, work more with that public sector funding that is there, and or how do we find ways to sort of navigate the situation that we're in now? Like, how do you see, you brought that up, right? We should be getting to the point where it's more private. How do we do it now? How do we make sure the public is involved? How do we bring that into the capital stack more and make sense of it?
From a lot of the funds that we work with at Invest, there's not enough hours in the day, really, if you're a small venture fund. So, but it's also, there's not a very clear process, which I liked seeing that solution that was presented earlier. But like, how do you help your startups, the startups that you're looking at, the startups that you've maybe already invested in, know that there's X or Y that they're eligible from a public standpoint that could be, and make them apply immediately, right? And to be able to leverage those dollars, not dilute the cap table, and then maybe come back in when the time is right for venture funding. Sam from Coral Vita was here earlier, and I think in a lot of cases there's a ton of hustle that happened, but there was a lot of grant funding and a lot of public money that had gone into getting them to the point of raising that Series A. So I think it's awareness, and not to AI this, but like there has to be systems, and like the one that we saw earlier, that can make it matchmaking, right? For your solution does X, here's the window for application. A question that I have though, and maybe you guys have looked into this, is international and that type of funding, because the stability of US public funding is really questionable. And I also get concerned about a company taking that in and it not being there for renewal in 2027, 2028. And then you really don't want to give it venture funding to kind of keep it alive. So how do we also set up companies? And I think our members are seeing this, like the venture investors, where they're creating, it's going in reverse. They're creating a headquarters in Australia or in Barcelona, where we were actually usually seeing a lot creating a US headquarters so they could get US money. So I think it's awareness and maybe more of that like international connectivity.
Well, and I think one of the things, and Millie and I have talked about this, we did just today even, that interestingly you have startups that come from Europe because they see the U.S. as a better field for various reasons. We see, because our headquarters is in Barcelona, a lot of continuing activity in spaces that have dropped in the U.S. And so I think your point and this point in general is one that it's going to have, both are true. We have to figure out both sides of that equation, whether that is both sides meaning over the Atlantic or Australia, Singapore, that came up earlier today. What do you, for the both of you, how do you see that?
I think from my perspective, a lot of the policies are, I think Hans and I were actually just talking about this, like they're event driven, and now that we're experiencing all these events right now, we're looking back at like the critical mineral, we're looking back at dual use. How do we all the autonomous vessels out there, right, getting crazy fundings. So it's almost like it's looking backwards and it's retrospective. And I think IMO, that's also a good example, right? We're looking into the decarbonization of maritime shipping, but we're just actively waiting here, and we're 2026 right now, and that's delayed again, right? So we can't wait for another 4 or 5 years to kind of like IMO pass, and then now we are finally de-risk. It's more like you got to have the de-risk opportunities and market first, and then the capital, the private capital is comfortable coming in to support, right? So the sequence again, right? Like I think talking about the sequence a couple of times now is flipped almost, and I think that's also a loop, right? Because because the government is now seeing the decarbonization economics working, and maybe it's not important enough. Maybe it's taking a long time. So it's almost like, I mean, like I don't have a good answer on how do we fix that, but I think that's kind of like our observation.
Great. So slightly different than the way we did this morning. I'm going to break for a second before I go back to my questions and go to the audience and see if there's anything that you want to ask to keep this side of the conversation going. And if not, I'll go back to my questions, but I want to give the audience a chance. We have a little less time for this panel. So anyone in the audience have questions or comments? Jason first.
I can take a stab. I mean, I can say we host these monthly sector groups, we get together a bunch of investors, and it doesn't usually come up. And so I would say it's pretty separate. I also wonder, and again, this kind of goes to needing multiple voices in the room, is I would hypothesize that in reverse, those who are championing blue bonds are not thinking about how it gets into early stage, like very promising disruptive technology and solutions. So, and that may not be the best use of like deployment of the capital. So I think, and to talk up progression, but just like this concept of how do we get government accelerators, venture investors, later stage. Also, we need a lot more Series B and C investors in the space. So shout out to what you guys are doing. But then how do we have on the complete other end that conversation? And what do those rooms look like? And also who funds it? Like, I think that's challenging because you'll get rooms where you have a lot of like government organizations talking to government organizations, maybe some universities, some research, and then you have more of the like, cocktail parties and venture and startups on stage, and there needs to be a safer space or like a better, whether it's virtual or in-person connection for that. So I'm not seeing it.
Yeah, and Jason, I would say just coincidentally, and this is a little bit of a PSA, in our Blue Finance Summit last year, we had a panel where we basically had blue bonds issuers, EIB, venture capital, a family office, basically debating this, because for World Ocean Council, those worlds should come together, but they are separate. It's very like that infrastructure, my old role, as you know, in island resilience and resilient cities, those are not meeting necessarily in the middle. And so I think part of our challenge is to kind of find a way to bring that gap together, right? It was brought up this morning, insurance and reinsurance are massive in that because there's so much infrastructure and risk and adaptation that have to come together with it. The guy that, and I remember this clearly, the blue bonds guy said, look, if we get the right blue bond issued, it will trickle down and we will hire and or buy at the very smallest level the kinds of innovations that we need for a project that's going to go on in a city or a port, and then therefore that blue bond is working at a very high level, but is also then touching at a base. That's rare at this point, right? You know that from your own island work. Other questions or thoughts?
I just think on that point, the sensitivity around different countries and the administrations that govern them. To your point, Kelsey, of some of these companies now trying to headquarter abroad in Australia or in other areas around the world where there may be better opportunity for them to access non-dilutive funding. So Hans, on the Blue Connects point, which I thought was a really interesting platform, I'm glad we got to see it today. That's one of the core use cases in my mind, is for a founder to understand how to access which part of the capital stack, when to access it, and who to be going to. Like if you are domestically based and headquartered, okay, you can go after this sort of grant versus an internationally available one. That's something that would be extremely useful, because I think there's a huge founder education in addition to investor education that needs to happen clearly. But I think founder education, to what I was alluding to earlier, we have a lot of folks going after equity-based financing because they think that's what they're supposed to do as a startup. But candidly, most of these hard tech companies should be going after non-dilutive in these other revolving credit facilities and working capital loans, these other debt facilities that are more appropriate for their timelines. So I think using Blue Connects as a way to connect the ecosystem around non-dilutive grants and things of that nature is something that could be great.
That's great, Ryan. Yeah. Thanks. Great point. Henry, you were going to say something, I think.
I think both of them covered it well, but I would just add, I think what we have seen for some of the early stage companies, yes, they lack of like the understanding of like where do we access, what kind of non-dilutive fundings are out there, and some of the times they might go to like a consultant, and that will cost them some money. So they resist, right? So I think it's how do we make it even more accessible for them and just easier for all the startups to kind of access that information.
One of the comments that was made on the earlier panel too was talking about public-private partnerships, and this relates to that public funding, but it's not just the funding, it's the structures, right? So I think part of Jason's question and what was brought up on the first panel for us and for the broader group is how do we then do what adaptation, resilience finance, and other kind of elements have done with the kinds of funds that you're talking to, the kinds of partners you're bringing to. How do we make that gel in the way that other sectors or maybe other verticals have?
I'll shout out to like Generator. I think you guys have an interesting model where you are collaborating usually with a corporation and to like get a demand signal. I think that that's a like very expedited way because you also have protection. I would think in the ocean space too, like if I'm thinking of maritime shipping or seafood or those where there's a lot of big corporate buyers, like that if you get the product to X level, that there's an uptake agreement or a couple $100,000 or $1 million purchase on the other end, and that then makes it where you don't have to take an alternative funding opportunity or stutter or be counting on that grant funding. That's an example that I've seen work that I want to see way more of.
I think using, a federally funded institution that we worked with Progression 2026 a couple weeks ago was NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And NASA JPL, they do an amazing job of plugging into the local ecosystem in Southern California. They're working with Anduril, with all Northrop Grumman, and those are larger companies, obviously, but also startups around Pasadena. And I think it's whoever, there are so many organizations governing and tackling oceans, especially even within the United States. How can we create almost a center of resources, IP, of these companies that come to NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory? They get to test and experiment in the resources and facilities available in Pasadena. They get to work with the NASA scientists. How can we create a system like that in oceans where the resources that MTS and World Oceans and NOAA and all of these other organizations have, if it's a central campus, right, where we bring the brightest minds in oceans together. But I've seen that very successfully play out through NASA and JPL. So maybe following a similar structure along those lines.
Yeah, I was at Duke University 3 weeks ago for a Blue Economy Summit and kind of a planning event, and this very subject came up, and I thought of some of the people in the room because the question of having corporates there with academia and pre-commercialization and literally at the invention stage, but also them wanting financiers to show up at various levels of the capital stack to have a common conversation. And I think your question, or maybe even your solution or suggestion, kept coming up there as well. It's like, how do we do that in unison? For World Ocean Council, if you don't know, like when we run our events, we're trying to get as many of those in the same room, but you don't always have the right players all the time. And I think part of this is, what are our assets or advantages in this room and on stage and elsewhere to sort of create whatever that is, virtual campus, to sort of bring this together. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Other questions from yes, Vanessa.
The Alta-C, right, is already, and we've got Scripps and Alta-C and Braid Theory and a lot of people operating in a similar space. So maybe we just have to continue to build out a physical ecosystem around it to the point where San Diego is the capital of ocean tech for the United States, and that's, there you go.
It also is frustrating and exciting to hear about this because there's a lot of duplicative work happening. So like that's something to identify. And then what was interesting about what you're bringing up is I do think while there's a lot of concern about grants and government funding in the States right now, some of these facilities that can lower like the overhead cost and the like experimentation cost should be like very, very discoverable by startups, right? Like obviously you have to have the merit to do it, but yes. So I think we're starting to circle around that. But I kind of had a question for you and the group.
This is what we're supposed to do.
Okay, yeah. Well, so the whole like limit, like the private pool of capital as well, it can also be questionable. And I think with oceans, while we're still trying to create a lot of data and really like figure out a magical way to put a price tag on the value of a living piece of coral or of, you know, the avoided weather events from living mangrove trees versus dead mangrove trees, like how do we tap into people who are, you know, at conferences like this, who have a lot of family wealth, that care about snorkeling over the summer, right? Or, you know, and how do we like change that narrative and get that money moving into it because they want to be able to vacation, or, you know, they understand that that's going to affect their beachfront property. So I don't know, and I don't know if that comes into your conversation or what kind of LPs you guys are tapping into for later stage, but it just seems like a missed opportunity.
Yeah. And I think one of the things we're seeing is some of the bigger corporations and their foundations are seeing those aspects, but it's only a few of them, right? There's not a great body of them that's saying, right, look at, here's the fisheries, ecotourism, coastal resilience, and guess what, innovation and venture capital all at once, right? That I think is rare for a big, like Maersk Foundation. They're doing that, and they've sort of honed in on coral, but that's because coral is a coastal resilience aspect, fisheries, you know, tourism, snorkeling, et cetera. So you can see that microcosm kind of being all built out. I think, like, we're talking a lot about technology right now, but I think one of the things that I'd love, and it's sort of an answer to your question, Kelsey, but it's also then for everyone else, it's also the other verticals. We have a lot of people that do blue food that are members of World Ocean Council. They have the same questions about how they go. Offshore floating wind, biodiversity, even the most nature-based solutions type. So I think you're asking a question and kind of prompting the solution, which is how are we coalescing these groups together? And I would love to hear from the audience as well. Like, how do we do this? Yes, let's go to you, Millie. Yeah, Richard said simple cells. I mean, we'll go to Sam after this. There was a person last night that said to me, and I'll take them at their word at this point, but we were talking about recycling and upcycling and all types of recycling. And they said to me, Stuart, if you could figure out how to create a center of excellence that was the entire spectrum of cycling and upcycling, from ships to plastics to furniture to cars and airplanes, and, you know, the full spectrum of circularity, that's something I might be interested in funding, which of course caught my attention. We had thought about doing a Center of Excellence on that, and we launched the Center of Excellence on Coastal Resilience last year that we're now just building out. We didn't do the circularity and circular materials, but that conversation last night gets a little bit, starts to defragment slightly, right? It's still in the upcycling, recycling, and kind of materials space, but it's better than I only do microplastics. Right? So I do think there's something about that, and maybe there needs to be, I don't know, 5 centers of excellence in 5 places that start to do this. I'm not sure, right? Sam? Yeah, and I think the storytelling part, which was not the main focus of the panel, is super important, and we heard about it this morning as well, because that storytelling is not cohesive. The reason I brought up Maersk Foundation is because as a member, but also because the head of the Maersk Foundation's LinkedIn has just exploded over the last 2 weeks because of these announcements they've been making about work that they've been doing around coral and island resilience, right? That's the storytelling that like caught my eye, and there's somebody I should know about, but I wasn't aware of, like this anniversary thing that they were doing. So again, part of this is that it's the fragmentation that Millie's talking about is also fragmented when we tell stories. And I think, Ryan, I'm looking at you because I also saw your LinkedIn, and the event that you did, the last 2, I would say, caught my eye, caught my algorithms at least. Not sure how many others, but that is attractive to people, and I think that's also somewhat of what we have to do.
No, absolutely. And I think it's not just about, right, it's storytelling from the corporate level, but that's also going to be a different type of story, right? It has to work. I think we need these like a Maersk, we need these corporates to come in and be patient capital stakeholders, have CVCs start to engage in actually investing in incubating tech. But I think beyond that, right? The storytelling is important because there's not going to be another Lucas Walton in the next generation of wealth if they grow up not being able to connect to climate or care about it because it's not cool and it's polarized and it's super liberal to be a climate supporter. We're not going to have more Lucas Waltons in this next generation of wealth. So I think that's why, with progression, we're hyper focused on, okay, let's bring in these sports platforms. Let's bring in these athletes, the culture around being outside and being outdoors. If the Protect Our Winters has a really interesting concept that they came up with. It's a nonprofit organization in the space called the Outdoor State. And they say if you take everyone in the United States that participates in outdoor sports and outdoor activities, it's whatever number of millions of people they put into it. It could be a very powerful legislation and lobbying group right there. I'm looking at it from the economic perspective behind that group, right? If you can capture the outdoor state and push that for both fundraising around the capital deployment, but also from the end state, the end consumer, and really reach it there, I think there's a powerful room that you can bring together and force there. So I think the storytelling around climate is, I look at where everyone's focused right now in the climate and ocean tech and all of this into 4 buckets: financing, regulatory, technology, and culture. And I think this cultural piece, the right side and the conservative administration right now has done an amazing job of making climate culturally taboo. We've been focused on the financing and the technology and the regulatory pieces, but the culture piece is what we need to lever more to bring this all together. So that's, yeah.
I completely agree with what Ryan said, I think. And I think that culture piece is, something that Ryan's working on, kind of bonding, whether that's the, different stakeholders, whether that's investors or corporates or companies together, right? And from our position, I think one of the other piece that could be is just how do you communicate your story? How do you tell your solutions, right? So good example, OptiScale was acquired by Insight Partners, but has Insight Partners really focused on ocean investment in the past? Probably not, right? So that's a good example of how a general investor is tapping into the space, as long as you have the right, whether that's economics or business model or traction or, just any, the way you communicating yourself, right? So I think if the founders were just any stakeholders, communicate the story in a way that is more accessible for the general investor space or general corporates, right? It just automatically tap into more audience and is helpful for them for the whole ecosystem.
In S2G, to toot your guys' horn, they played a big role in the Nat Gala, which happened at Climate Week, if any of you are familiar with that in New York, which they brought together actors and celebrities and Harrison Ford and Jane Fonda and all of these individuals to raise money around climate through a different context, through this cultural context, which I think was amazing for S2G to be involved in, and we need more efforts like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing that the winter idea reminds me of is we have a partner in Barcelona who runs a major maritime transportation school out of Barcelona, but all across the Mediterranean. And Edward will often say, I want there to be a Mediterranean passport. And his point is that there is such a connection to that basin, and it's often bifurcated or broken into all kinds of different pieces, both the kind of fragmentation that Millie's talking about, but also then geography and all kinds of other fragmentations, right? And his whole point is if we all had a Mediterranean passport and we worked on these things together, right, we would not have as much of the financial, cultural, forget what Ryan said, but those 4 buckets wouldn't be so fragmented. Other questions or thought from the audience? We have a few more minutes because then we have to go to our breakouts, but yeah. So just quickly to repeat that question so everybody heard it. The question is for an NGO that's coming into the space, and luckily we sat next together at lunch, so I'm a little bit more privy. But for the Guy Harvey Foundation, looking in, and this is a question for the investors, that question that Ms. Harvey's asking is, what are those from an education standpoint? Are there investments? Are there ways to connect the work that they're doing as an NGO to connect the education piece? It's interesting because after we had lunch together, I had a conversation about this. So I do have one point of my own. But how do we connect what they're doing to the education and the kind of workforce development and youth and specific topic areas to the investment world, because that's not necessarily about tech, or it's not necessarily about something specific. So I knew you guys could probably hear, but just for everybody else, how do you answer that? It's really an interesting, and we're glad that you're here joining us.
Can I clarify? Are we looking to educate the NGO space about these investment opportunities and increase that literacy? Yeah. Well, I have an example with Invest because we're a club. So our job is to bring together a bunch of investors and educate them on spaces. And so we've seen catalytic funding come in, and our whole output goals are let's in this space increase the number of ocean investors, increase the number of really the back and forth and the scientific literacy and access to the latest research papers or landscaping across the 1,000 different ocean startups that are solving a very similar problem, to help them identify, boil it down to, okay, here's the 5 startups, and to your point, to try to put more concentrated capital into them. So I think there are different organizations that kind of focus on, we call it literacy. But I wonder if there's also, it can go in the other way, in reverse, and this may not be what you're touching on, but I also just think there's a lot of education of the average person doesn't know where there's the bang for their buck, right? Or what actions are going to be the most sustainable, or how they can put their energy most effectively. So and again, to the kind of awareness and fandom and sports, and I think there's a marketing problem just for the whole population as well. These solutions should be sexy and accessible and tied to the NFL. So I think there's that side of the whole education and marketing. I think that answered your question, but anyone want to add or clarification?
Yeah, I mean, I think there, to your point, and maybe you're getting at this, that there's a huge education gap in families or whoever coming up looking to deploy capital, even knowing that they can deploy it into companies that are protecting the environment, or that there's other resources like an Invest to join where you can see these opportunities. I think there's an education piece, like I said earlier, on the founder side of knowing who to be looking after and going to for capital, and when to be going for that capital. But I think on the nonprofit side, what I find really interesting is a lot of nonprofits, again, at the end of the day, they go after policy work, in regulatory work, in legislation that is inherently partisan. When you Protect Our Winners, which I mentioned earlier, they go, a lot of their efforts are focused on policy work. So they're bringing, Shaun White or these big athletes to DC to try to tackle conservative policy, but you're making it about politics. And so you're really, minimizing that neutralization layer. So I think at the end of the day, nonprofits, a lot of philanthropy has been really misoriented because it needs to be focused. We need to use, the capital stack is not coordinated right now, and it's because we're asking venture to fund opportunities that philanthropy should be the first money in the door, and then we're asking venture, whoever, family offices, to go after infrastructure opportunities, right? Where J.P. Morgan should be stepping up to the table, or whoever in the field, Brookfield. And so with that said, I think nonprofits, I want to push nonprofits. Yes, there's this education piece, and there's an important way that we can allow nonprofits to play that role. Like at our last Progression conference, we had them, these government agencies, run a roundtable with top investors and ask the investors, okay, how can we copy your private playbooks in our public situations and all of that? But I think even more so, nonprofits need to be playing a role in the curation of capital at this stage, because we've created an echo chamber where we have the same financial institutions signaling and curating capital opportunities in this market. And what has it resulted in? Overinvestment, over-engineering of repetitive solutions. We have 1 million carbon accounting startups right now. And it's because carbon accounting is high-margin software that VCs are going to view to be a traditionally good bet. But we need the perspectives of nonprofits that don't have a financial interest. I think that's one of the biggest roles you can play as a nonprofit. You don't have a financial interest involved, but you're still a subject matter expert in your own right. You sit close enough to the problem. Your opinion should be included in these capital curation conversations. So that's exactly what we do through Progression. We have a double IC process. So we have both investors and proximity stakeholders evaluate the companies. So the companies that get on stage at Progression are not just portfolio companies of some organizing VC fund, right? They're companies that have the stamp of approval from both investors and proximity stakeholders, or nonprofits, government agencies, academics, folks that sit close but don't have that financial interest. So I think that's a really interesting role that I want nonprofit and philanthropy to play more of, is, okay, we need to be involved in this stage of the investment cycle, because we've seen right now through this administration, I mean, policy it's always going to be circular. It's going to come in and out of fashion. So we need the private markets to get activated.
I want to repeat what Ryan just said. I think I was nodding the whole time, so I agree what he said. I think it's just managing up, right? Like, for us, growth equity, probably, going to the PE buyers, understanding what are some business model or sectors they're interested in, or even corporates, right? We have a dedicated business development team that work with the corporates, just understanding, what are some gaps in your supply chain, what are some things you're looking for in the next 3 to 5 years. So managing up, understanding, throughout the capital stack, what is getting passed along and what is what are you looking for retrospectively from your next stakeholder, what are they looking for? And then I think looking back to, what's out there, what should we support? So.
Yeah, and I think what we talked about at lunch, we just won an EU grant as part of a collaborative that was around ocean literacy for private stakeholders, corporations, to connect with youth, because there was such a massive gap, and still is, right? Unfortunately, that's just an EU grant, so that's not a global operation that we can roll out. But it's an important test bed, because I think if Guy Harvey and World Ocean Council was doing that at a global scale, and we were having the right conversation with private sector and youth and workforce training, then we'd be hitting at something that would start to change a little bit of the dynamic before it gets to this point. We're going to go to one more question here. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think currently what's going on right now is a very timid investing environment, especially, again, I speak because I sit for the family office or I work for a private family office, so I know from an LP perspective, especially within climate, there's no DPI at venture funds. So there's been a trickle down, right? In founders, everyone, fund managers that are raising venture funds right now are also feeling this same effect, that their people are very cautious with their capital right now, especially deploying into early stage capital, into these capital intensive verticals like ocean tech, climate, manufacturing, robotics, anything that has proven that it's not going to scale at the same velocity as software. I think we're going to come to a high friction point over the next couple of years here. I think we're experiencing it right now, but there is going to be a pullback in LP funding, and that's going to be felt by both venture fund managers, but also by founders that are going out to fundraise. Right now, AI is what's buttressing most of what's going on. So if you don't have an AI story to tell, it's been very difficult for private funding in general.
So before we run out of time, I want to give all three of you the last word. And that last word is, what do we do for the next time we all get together? Just one idea. Could be 30 seconds, could be a minute, not more than a minute. What do we do for the next time that we're all in the room, and others that we need to bring together? So any one of you can start, and then we'll go into a break. Ryan, I feel like you
Wow.
have very specific ideas. So now, what do we do the next time we're all together?
I think I'm going to address the LP challenge. And I think we should do an event or partner with an existing event that is much more about the entertainment, whether it is on the sports side or music, or it gets people in the room and potentially, those family offices or people who are like attracted to the glamour of it, and to make it very easy and actionable for them to put their donations or that chunk of their budget into a fund or a technology or a solution that's like been de-risked by the experts. I think it also would just be really fun and maybe less blue suits. So
An LP party, okay? That's the first suggestion.
I would love to have an entire session focused on infrastructure and debt. And I have, those debt providers, Brookfield and, JP and all these folks have from founders and investors, and talk about debt from the very beginning to when those people can come into the picture, is specifically within the context of ocean tech, right? And what type of ocean tech is JP Morgan actually comfortable with, it, right? In those sorts of questions. So, yeah.
Yeah, we nearly had them in the room, so very much love that idea. So, yep, okay, we're in the debt. We're gonna have a debt party. Henry, over to you.
I think we should add another party to that. I mean, we can do maritime shipping party, or we can do aquaculture party, right? I think also, like, Ryan talked about this, right? Like, how do we pick out, several or like a few sectors that already at the stage of, like they're at the pivotal point. Historically, it's a lot of families, whether it's Norwegian families in aquaculture or maritime shipping families, right? But, they're needing the private capital to grow, and they're needing that capital to make a transition, right? Whether that's decarbonizing the maritime industry or making aquaculture more sustainable. So finding several sectors that are at that stage and bring them in, and then, promoting them, right? Getting more people into it, I think is just always helpful.
Okay, great. So first, a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you. And we did try to avoid the thematic. It starts to pop up, right? We're trying to stay in the blue stack, but I think to the point of the parties, it is why we have verticals. And so to some extent, getting those verticals together, whether it's in a form that's all the LPs or whatever it is, we may have to do that, and it's something to consider. What we're going to do now is go on a break, but when we come back, when we call you back, we're going to go straight into the breakouts. And the idea is basically, especially for those that don't like to raise their hand or are more cautious about things they say out loud, we're going to basically split into two breakouts. One is that blue capital stack, and the other is the verticals and the thematic, and split in and start to tackle these questions that we've been talking about on each of the panels in a more kind of broken down and very specific way with you in the breakouts, and then we'll come back and hear what everybody had to say. We need to come back after our break because we wanted to give you time to network again, especially after a panel like this. So let's come back at 3:15. And at 3:15, we'll begin our breakouts, and then we'll come back after that and do a debrief. Yeah. That's great. And if you don't know 1,000 Ocean Startups, for those that are, there's members in here of 1,000 Ocean Startups. World Ocean Council is an affiliate member. So it really spans what is fractional at this point, as Millie said, but it really covers a lot of those verticals, that access that is much more than Ocean Enterprise or data and tech. So that's super important. Thanks, Vanessa, because we need to actually jump onto things that are already happening and not be duplicative. So we'll see you back here at 3:15 and pick up in the breakouts. Thanks, everybody.